A less-known detail you might observe is the desperate attempts by some secular authorities, particularly in regions like Poland and parts of Italy, to protect their Jewish populations from these pogroms. Some rulers recognized the economic value of Jewish communities and tried to suppress the false accusations, sometimes even issuing decrees protecting them. However, these efforts were often overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the popular hysteria and the fanaticism of the mobs. You might see a small contingent of guards trying to hold back a furious crowd, their faces grim, knowing their efforts are likely futile. Imagine, if you will, that it's 1346 or 1347. You're in a small village or maybe a bustling town, somewhere in Europe. Your life, though difficult, has a familiar rhythm. You wake up to the roosters crowing, work in the fields or in the workshop, eat simple meals with your family, and go to bed when the sun goes down. Your world is small, surrounded by familiar roads, familiar faces, and familiar worries about crops, taxes, and the health of your family. Beyond Jewish communities, other marginalized groups also become targets. Beggars, vagrants, foreigners, and those deemed outsiders are viewed with suspicion. Old women, particularly those who live alone or practice traditional herbal remedies, are accused of witchcraft, of having made pacts with the devil to bring the plague upon the innocent. You recall the pervasive fear of witchcraft, and now in the crucible of the plague, that fear turns deadly. But then, something begins to change. At first, it is just vague rumors, stories told by weary traders from the Far East, or sailors on ships arriving from strange lands. They speak of a terrible plague, a great death that is sweeping through the cities and villages of Asia. These stories sound far-fetched, almost like scary fairy tales. Hard to believe in your familiar world. You may say to yourself, well, at least it's not my problem. You see individuals dragged before makeshift courts, accused of conjuring the pestilence through dark magic. Confessions are extracted through brutal torture, implicating others, creating a terrifying chain reaction of accusations. The logic is twisted, fueled by desperation if we can find the human cause. We can stop the divine punishment. The innocent are sacrificed on the altar of fear. Their suffering a grim testament to the human need for an explanation, however irrational. You might even hear someone say, well, at least we're getting to the root of the problem. A chillingly ironic statement. The whispers gradually become clearer. Pilgrims returning from the Holy Land, soldiers trudging from distant wars, and merchants from eastern ports began to bring more horrifying tales. They spoke of abandoned cities, where the streets were lined with corpses, where no one was left alive to bury the dead. They spoke of a disease that caused hideous black swellings on the body, a violent fever, and death that came quickly, often within days. The breakdown of social order, which you've already witnessed, facilitates this persecution. With traditional authorities weakened or absent, mobs and self-appointed vigilantes take the law into their own hands. There is no one to protect the accused, no one to uphold justice. The rule of law is replaced by the rule of fear and prejudice, leading to unchecked brutality. You tried to brush these stories aside. They were too horrible to be true. How could a disease kill so many people? Your world had seen wars, famines, and small plagues, but nothing like what they were describing. You went about your life, trying to focus on your daily tasks, but those whispers, like a sad song, lingered in the back of your mind. The psychological impact on those who survived these persecutions is immense. They carry not only the trauma of the plague itself, but also the indelible scars of hatred and violence. They are forced to flee their homes, to abandon their possessions, and to live in constant fear. Their lives irrevocably altered by the prejudice of their fellow human beings. The plague, in a horrifying twist, becomes a catalyst for even greater human cruelty. It is a common historical fact that the Black Death is believed to have originated in Central Asia, possibly in the steppes, and spread along the Silk Road. It reached Europe via trade routes, especially through Mediterranean port cities. The ships that carried precious cargo also carried invisible carriers of the disease rats and fleas. As ships from the east begin to arrive in European ports, these whispers cease to be rumors. They become an existential threat. You hear of Italian ports Messina, Genoa, Venice, where ships are arriving with dead or dying crews. The survivors, if any, bring horrifying tales of death and despair, The authorities attempt to quarantine the ships, but it is too late. The invisible enemy has set foot on shore. Historians still debate whether the anti-Jewish pogroms were primarily a result of pre-existing anti-Semitism, or if the Black Death simply provided a convenient and terrifying excuse for long-simmering resentments to erupt into violence. It's a complex and uncomfortable question, as both factors undoubtedly played a role, creating a devastating feedback loop of fear and hatred. But for you living through it, the violence is horrifyingly real. You begin to see small changes in your community. Strangers, refugees from the stricken cities, begin to appear bearing tales of devastation. They look thin, frightened, and sometimes they carry ominous signs of disease. Though you feel pity, a cold fear also creeps into your heart. Do they bring death with them, even within families? Suspicion can fester. If one member of a household recovers while others die, they might be viewed with suspicion, accused of having made a pact or of possessing some secret knowledge. The bonds of trust, already frayed by fear of contagion, are further eroded by the insidious poison of suspicion and accusation. A little-known detail is that some people tried to escape the affected cities by moving to the countryside. However, this often only helped spread the disease faster, as they carried fleas and bacteria to unaffected areas. You might see a wealthy family arriving from a big city, carrying wagons loaded with goods, and you wonder if they brought anything else with them. You might say to yourself, well, at least they can run away from their problem. The search for scapegoats is a desperate attempt to regain control in a world that has spiraled into chaos. If there is a human cause, then there can be a human solution, a way to fight back against the invisible enemy. But this false sense of agency only leads to more suffering, diverting attention from the true nature of the plague and exacerbating the human tragedy. The doctors, whom you trusted to cure the sick, also began to feel helpless. They did not understand the cause of the disease, and their treatments, bloodletting, poultices, prayers, were completely useless. You heard of doctors fleeing the cities, or falling ill themselves and dying. Faith in traditional medicine began to falter, leaving a terrifying void of helplessness. The persecution also serves a psychological function for the persecutors. By externalizing the blame by finding a tangible enemy, they can temporarily alleviate their own overwhelming fear and helplessness. It provides a perverse sense of unity, a common enemy to rally against, even if that enemy is entirely fabricated. The mob mentality, fueled by terror, becomes a powerful and destructive force. Superstition and belief in omens begin to increase. People see signs of God's punishment everywhere comets in the sky. Earthquakes, unusual floods. Priests preach about the sins of mankind, warning that the plague is God's retribution for their evil deeds. The fear of death mixes with the fear of God's judgment, creating an atmosphere of despair. The legacy of this period of blame and persecution is a dark stain on the history of the Black Death. It reminds you that even in the face of unimaginable natural disaster, humanity's capacity for cruelty and irrationality can be just as terrifying. The plague not only killed millions, but also exposed the deep-seated prejudices and fears that lay dormant beneath the surface of medieval society, waiting for a crisis to bring them to light. Trade routes begin to be disrupted, goods no longer arrive as before, and prices begin to skyrocket. You see merchants worried, markets deserted. Your already fragile economy begins to feel the strain. The fear of disease mixes with the fear of famine, creating an all-encompassing sense of insecurity. You begin to see people you know fall ill. At first, it's people far away, people you rarely see. But then it gets closer. A neighbor, a friend of a friend, then a family member. The symptoms are exactly what you've heard: high fevers, chills, and hideous, painful black bumps appearing in the groin, armpits, or neck. These are called buboes, and they're an unmistakable sign of impending death. As night falls and the city remains eerily quiet, you might hear the distant cries of a new mob forming, or the desperate screams of those being hunted. The fear of the plague is still there, gnawing at your insides, but now it is compounded by the chilling knowledge that your fellow human beings, consumed by terror, can be just as deadly as the disease itself. You are here in the midst of the Black Death, and the search for scapegoats is turning neighbor against neighbor, adding another layer of horror to an already unimaginable catastrophe. Death comes quickly. Often, a person who is healthy in the morning can be dead by evening. There's no time to say goodbye, no time to prepare. The suddenness of death is a huge shock, shattering every expectation of life and death you've ever known. You see families devastated in a matter of days, homes abandoned, lives cut cruelly short. You have endured the horrifying physical agony of the buboes, witnessed the terrifying collapse of society, and seen the desperate, often brutal, search for scapegoats. The city is a landscape of fear and suspicion, its streets echoing with the cries of the sick and the shouts of the mobs. But as the Black Death continues its relentless, indiscriminate slaughter, you confront perhaps the most overwhelming and visceral horror of all the sheer, unimaginable scale of death, leading to a grim harvest of bodies, mass graves, and the chilling reality of the unburied dead. Historians still debate whether the Black Death was a new, particularly virulent strain of bacteria, or whether factors like malnutrition and war weakened the European population, making it more vulnerable. It's a complex question, involving both biological and social factors. But for you living through it, the reasons are less important than the fear and loss the plague caused. Imagine yourself just a few months into the plague's full fury. The constant, mournful tolling of church bells has ceased, not because the dying has stopped, but because there are no longer enough healthy bell ringers left. The silence is now punctuated only by the creak of overloaded carts, the occasional desperate wail, and the buzzing of flies. The air, already thick with the stench of sickness, now carries the overpowering, sickeningly sweet odor of decay. It is the smell of death, pervasive and inescapable, clinging to your clothes, your hair, your very soul. Fear begins to change people's behavior. Some become more religious, praying incessantly, believing that penance can save them. Others become more insatiable, living for the moment, believing that tomorrow they might be dead. You see wild parties, acts of violence, and a gradual collapse of social norms. Death, an invisible enemy, is slowly eating away not only the bodies but also the souls of your community. The death toll is staggering. In a normal year, a city might see a few dozen, perhaps 100 deaths. Now it is hundreds a day, sometimes thousands. The traditional methods of dealing with the dead, individual burials, solemn funeral processions, periods of mourning, are utterly overwhelmed. There is simply no time, no space, and no one left to perform these sacred duties. The living are too few, too weak, and too terrified to properly honor the dead. You begin to hear the church bells ringing constantly, not to signal the time of service, but to signal new deaths. The sound becomes a cacophony of horror, a constant reminder of the devastation that is taking place. You learn to live with the sound, but it never ceases to haunt you. You see bodies everywhere as they lie in houses, abandoned where they fell, their faces contorted in agony. They lie in the streets, slumped against walls or sprawled in the gutters, their last breaths taken in public view. Shops are shuttered, and if you dare to peer inside, you might see the motionless forms of entire families, struck down together. The sheer volume of the dead is incomprehensible, a horrifying testament to the plague's indiscriminate power. You might even find yourself thinking, well, at least I won't have to worry about finding a seat at the tavern anymore. As the whispers from the east become the roar of death at your doorstep, you realize that your world will never be the same again. The Black Death was more than a plague. It was a history-changing event, a destroyer not only of life but of faith, hope, and social order. Here you are on the eve of the storm, and you know that your life and the lives of all around you are about to be tested in the most terrible way. You've heard the whispers, the chilling rumors of a great pestilence sweeping across distant lands. You've seen the worried faces of merchants and the desperate eyes of refugees. The fear, once a distant echo, has grown into a palpable hum, a low thrum of anxiety beneath the surface of your daily life. Now, as the seasons turn and the days grow shorter, that distant threat finally arrives. Not with a roar, but with a silent, unseen messenger, bringing an unimaginable horror directly to your city gates. The gravediggers, as traditionally a small, specialized profession, are among the hardest hit. Their constant contact with the infected bodies makes them highly susceptible to the plague, and they die off rapidly. Those who remain are few, exhausted, and often terrified. They work tirelessly, their faces grim, but they cannot keep up with the relentless demand. The ground, once sacred burial sites, is now simply a place to dispose of the dead as quickly as possible. Imagine, if you will, a bustling port city, perhaps Genoa or Venice, in the autumn of 1347. You are there, a common citizen, going about your daily life. The harbor is usually a vibrant tapestry of sounds and smells, the creak of ship timbers, the shouts of dock workers, the cries of gulls, the scent of fish and foreign spices. But today, something is different. A fleet of trading ships, returning from the Black Sea, slowly makes its way into the harbor. They are expected, but there's an unsettling silence about them. No joyous shouts from the crew, no bustling activity on deck. A common historical fact is the creation of vast mass graves, or plague pits, in and around cities. When traditional churchyards became full, and individual burials were no longer feasible, large trenches were dug, sometimes dozens of feet deep, into which hundreds, even thousands of bodies were unceremoniously dumped. These pits were often filled layer by layer, with quicklime sometimes thrown over the corpses to hasten decomposition and reduce the stench. As the ships draw closer, a chilling sight greets your eyes. The sails are tattered, the rigging slack, and the decks are eerily still. Many of the sailors are dead, their bodies slumped against the rails or lying motionless on the planks. Those who are still alive are barely so, their faces gaunt, their eyes sunken, their bodies racked with fever and covered in ghastly black swellings. The stench emanating from the ships is horrific, a foul odor of sickness and decay that hangs heavy in the air, even over the salty tang of the sea. You witness the grim process. Carts, often repurposed from carrying goods, rumble through the streets, collecting the dead. Bodies are stripped of their clothing, often looted by desperate survivors, and piled onto the carts, their limbs tangled, their faces frozen in expressions of agony or terror. There is no reverence, no dignity, just the brutal efficiency of disposal. The cart drivers, often condemned criminals or the desperate poor, wear cloths over their faces, trying to block out the stench and the fear, but their eyes betray their horror. The city authorities, alarmed by this horrifying spectacle, try to act. They order the ships to be turned away, to be quarantined outside the harbor, hoping to prevent the contagion from spreading. But it is already too late. The unseen messengers have already disembarked, scurrying down the mooring ropes, slipping silently onto the docks. These are the rats, common companions on any ship, carrying with them the true agents of death, the fleas, and within those fleas, the Yersinia pestis bacterium, the horrifying reality of the Black Death. At the plague pits, the bodies are simply tipped in, falling with a sickening thud into the growing mounds of corpses. There is no ceremony, no prayer, no final farewell. The living simply push the dead into the earth, their only thought to quickly finish the task and escape the overwhelming stench and the ever-present threat of contagion. You see the layers of bodies, men, women, and children, piled one upon another. A horrifying cross-section of humanity united in death. You don't see the flea. Of course, you don't know about the bacteria. All you know is that within days, the whispers become screams. People in the port district, those who first came into contact with the ships, begin to fall ill. The symptoms are unmistakable, terrifyingly consistent with the rumors you've heard. It starts suddenly a high fever, chills, overwhelming fatigue, and excruciating pain in the limbs. Then, the telltale sign, the horrifying hallmark of the plague, the buboes. A less known detail you might observe is the desperate attempts of some families to perform private, clandestine burials, unable to access churchyards or unwilling to see their loved ones thrown into a mass pit. They would sometimes bury bodies in their own gardens or in secluded spots outside the city walls, under the cover of darkness. These were acts of profound love and defiance, a desperate attempt to reclaim some dignity for the dead in a world that had lost all semblance of order. You might see a shovel hidden under a cloak, or a freshly turned patch of earth in a quiet garden, and understand the silent tragedy it represents. These are painful, swollen lymph nodes, often the size of an apple or an egg, appearing in the groin, armpits, or neck. They are black or purple, filled with pus and blood, and they are incredibly tender to the touch. You see them on your neighbors, on your friends, on your family, They are a grim, undeniable mark of death. The sight of a bubo sends a jolt of pure terror through you, for you know what it means. You might even find yourself checking your own armpits every 5 minutes, just in case. The stench of death becomes an inescapable part of life. It permeates everything: the air you breathe, the food you eat, the clothes you wear. It is a constant, nauseating reminder of the plague's presence, a sensory assault that dulls your appetite and haunts your sleep. You try to burn aromatic herbs to carry flowers to your nose, but nothing truly masks the pervasive odor of decay. The progression of the disease is terrifyingly swift. A person who is healthy and vibrant in the morning can be dead by nightfall. The fever rages, delirium sets in, and the body rapidly succumbs. The speed of death is perhaps the most shocking aspect of the plague. There's no time for goodbyes, no time for last rites, no time for preparation. Life is simply extinguished, abruptly and brutally. You witness families decimated in days, entire households silenced by the relentless march of the disease. The psychological impact of this constant exposure to death is profound. You become desensitized, perhaps into the sight of corpses, but the trauma lingers. You walk past dead bodies with a grim acceptance, your emotions dulled by the sheer scale of the tragedy. Yet, in quiet moments, the faces of those you knew, those you loved, flash before your eyes, and the grief, though suppressed, is overwhelming. You live in a world of ghosts, haunted by the memory of those who are gone. The common historical fact is that the bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, was primarily transmitted to humans through the bites of infected fleas, which lived on black rats. When the rats died, the fleas sought new hosts, including humans, thus spreading the disease rapidly through urban populations. The close living conditions, poor sanitation, and abundance of rats in medieval cities created a perfect breeding ground for the epidemic. The concept of community, already frayed by fear and suspicion, is further eroded by the overwhelming number of deaths. Families are wiped out, leaving no one to inherit their property or continue their lineage. Entire neighborhoods are emptied, their houses standing silent and abandoned, monuments to lives extinguished. The social fabric is torn apart, leaving gaping holes that may never be mended. As the death toll mounts, the city begins to change. The bustling streets grow quiet, the markets empty, shops are shuttered, their owners either dead or fled. The cheerful sounds of daily life are replaced by a haunting silence, broken only by the mournful tolling of church bells, not for services, but for the dead. The bells ring almost constantly, a relentless symphony of despair, a constant reminder of the unseen enemy that stalks every corner. You learn to live with that sound, but it never ceases to chill you to the bone. Historians still debate the exact number of deaths caused by the Black Death, with estimates ranging from 30% to 60% of Europe's population. The difficulty in obtaining accurate records from the period, and the varying impact across different regions, makes precise figures elusive. However, the common historical fact remains that it was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, fundamentally reshaping the demographic landscape of the continent. A less-known detail you might observe is the strange behavior of the animals. Rats, disoriented and dying, stumble out into the open, their bodies twitching. Cats and dogs, also susceptible to the plague, sicken and die in the streets. The absence of their usual sounds, the eerie quiet of the animal world, adds another layer to the unsettling atmosphere. It's as if nature itself is holding its breath, waiting for the horror to pass. You might even see a cat cough and think, oh no, not mittens too. The unburied dead pose a terrifying threat. Their decaying bodies become breeding grounds for disease, attracting flies and vermin, further exacerbating the spread of the plague. The authorities, if any remain, issue desperate decrees for the disposal of bodies, threatening fines or punishment for those who fail to comply. But these threats are often meaningless in the face of overwhelming death and fear. Fear, a powerful and insidious force, begins to warp human behavior. Some people, consumed by terror, abandon their sick family members, fleeing the city in a desperate, often futile, attempt to escape the contagion. Others, believing the end is nigh, turn to wild abandon, indulging in reckless pleasures, drinking, feasting, and engaging in debauchery. convinced that tomorrow they will be dead anyway. You see both extremes utter despair and frantic hedonism, two sides of the same coin of fear. You see the desperation in the eyes of the survivors. They are exhausted, malnourished, and profoundly traumatized. Their faces are gaunt, their eyes sunken, their movements slow and deliberate. They walk among the dead, living ghosts in a city of corpses. Their only goal to survive another day, to breathe another breath. You might even find yourself laughing hysterically at a morbid joke. Like, I guess the housing market is really opening up now. The medical knowledge of the time is utterly useless against this new, terrifying foe. Doctors, if they haven't already fled or died themselves, resort to desperate and often bizarre remedies. They try bloodletting, believing it will remove the bad humors from the body. They apply poultices of herbs or even dried toad to the buboes, hoping to draw out the poison. They burn aromatic woods and herbs, believing the bad air miasma is the cause of the disease. None of it works. You watch helpless, as those you love suffer and die, knowing that the healers you once trusted are as powerless as you are. The very landscape of the city is transformed. Streets that were once vibrant thoroughfares are now silent corridors of death. Buildings that once echoed with laughter and conversation are now empty shells, their windows staring out like vacant eyes. The city, once a symbol of human achievement, has become a monument to human vulnerability, a vast, open tomb. The sheer number of dead bodies quickly overwhelms the traditional systems of burial. Graveyards fill up, and then overflow. Priests, monks, and gravediggers sicken and die, leaving fewer and fewer people to perform the grim task. Bodies are left in houses, in the streets, accumulating in horrifying piles. Mass graves are dug, vast pits into which bodies are unceremoniously dumped, sometimes hundreds at a time, covered with a thin layer of earth. The dignity of death, a small comfort in normal times, is utterly lost in the face of such widespread calamity. The psychological toll of living in such an environment is immense. You develop a profound sense of fatalism, a belief that your life is not in your own hands, but subject to the whims of an unseen, merciless force. Hope, once a driving force, becomes a fragile, almost dangerous emotion. You learn to live in the present moment, for the future is an uncertain void, and the past is a landscape of loss. The social fabric of the city begins to unravel. Law and order break down. Thieves and looters roam the empty streets, preying on the abandoned homes of the dead. The bonds of community, once strong, fray under the relentless pressure of death and fear. Neighbors turn against neighbors, accusing each other of spreading the disease, or of being witches who have conjured the pestilence. Trust evaporates, replaced by suspicion and self-preservation. You might even see a thief trying to pick a dead man's pocket and think, well, that's one way to get ahead, I guess. The Black Death, you realize, is not just a disease that kills, it is a force that strips away everything that makes life meaningful. It takes not only lives, but also dignity, order, faith, and hope. It reduces humanity to its most primal struggle for survival, leaving behind a scarred landscape and a traumatized populace. The church, the bedrock of medieval society, struggles to provide answers or comfort. Priests die at alarming rates, often among the first to succumb due to their constant contact with the sick and dying. Sermons preach repentance, warning that the plague is God's divine punishment for the sins of humanity. Processions of flagellants, individuals who publicly whip themselves to atone for sins, appear in the streets, their chanting and self-mutilation a desperate plea for divine mercy. But even these acts of extreme piety seem to have no effect on the relentless march of death. As night falls and the city is plunged into an even deeper silence, you hear only the distant howl of a dog, a mournful lament that seems to echo the grief of the entire world. You close your eyes, but the images of the mass graves, the unburied dead, and the overwhelming stench of decay linger in your mind. You are here, in the midst of the Black Death, and the grim harvest of bodies is a chilling testament to its horrifying reality. Historians still debate whether the rapid spread of the Black Death was solely due to the bubonic form, or if a more virulent pneumonic form, which could spread directly from person to person through airborne droplets, also played a significant role. It's a complex question, as both forms of the plague are incredibly deadly, and the historical accounts often blend symptoms. But for you, living through it, the distinction is meaningless. All you know is that death is everywhere. You have witnessed the grim harvest of bodies, the mass graves, and the chilling reality of the unburied dead. You've seen society crumble, its order dissolving into chaos, and humanity's desperate search for scapegoats. Now, as the Black Death continues its relentless, indiscriminate slaughter, you confront perhaps the most profound and agonizing crisis of all the testing of faith. The agonizing silence of God in the face of unimaginable suffering, and the desperate struggle for spiritual solace in a world consumed by death. The psychological toll is immense. You live with a constant gnawing fear, never knowing if you or your loved ones will be next. Sleep offers little respite, often filled with nightmares of fevered faces and silent burials. The trauma of witnessing so much death, so much suffering, leaves an indelible mark on your soul. You become hardened, perhaps, but also deeply scarred. Your understanding of life and death irrevocably altered. Imagine yourself in a city where death is everywhere and its stench a constant companion. The churches, once the bedrock of your world, now stand eerily quiet, their bells largely silent. The few surviving priests are overwhelmed, their voices hoarse from endless last rites, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and despair. The comforting rituals of daily mass, confession, and communion, once central to your life, have become rare, often impossible. The very presence of God, once so palpable in the sacred spaces, seems to have receded, leaving behind a terrifying void. The very air seems to carry the scent of death. The pervasive odor of decay, of unwashed bodies, of burning incense trying to mask the stench, becomes a constant assault on your senses. You try to breathe shallowly, to cover your nose with a cloth, but it's an inescapable reality. The city, once a vibrant hub of life, has become a vast open graveyard. For centuries, the church had provided answers, comfort, and a clear framework for understanding the world. Every misfortune, every illness, every death could be explained as God's will, a test or a punishment for sin. But the scale of the Black Death defies easy explanation. How could a loving God allow such widespread, indiscriminate suffering? Why are the righteous dying alongside the wicked, the innocent children alongside the hardened sinners? The traditional theological explanations begin to ring hollow, failing to provide solace in the face of such overwhelming horror. As the days turn into weeks, and the death toll continues its horrifying ascent, you realize that your world has been irrevocably changed. The Black Death is not just a disease, it is an event that has shattered the foundations of society, of faith, and of human expectation. It has exposed the fragility of life, the limitations of human knowledge, and the depths of both human despair and resilience. You hear sermons from the few remaining preachers that the plague is God's divine punishment for the sins of humanity. They preach fire and brimstone, urging repentance, warning that only through extreme piety can salvation be found. You see people, driven by terror, performing acts of public penance. The flagellant movement, which you've glimpsed before, grows in intensity. Groups of men and women, their faces contorted in agony, parade through the streets, publicly whipping themselves with knotted cords, their backs raw and bleeding. They chant prayers, confess their sins, and beg for divine mercy, believing that their suffering will atone for the collective wickedness of mankind and appease an angry God. You might even see someone so desperate they're trying to outsuffer the buboes, which, let's be honest, is a pretty high bar. You look at the faces of the few survivors around you, gaunt and weary, their eyes holding a haunted look. You are among them, still breathing, still enduring. But the city around you, once so familiar, is now a landscape of ghosts, a chilling monument to the horrifying reality of the Black Death. The whispers have become a roar, and the unseen messenger has delivered its devastating payload. However, as the plague continues its relentless march, claiming the most devout as readily as the most sinful, the efficacy of these extreme acts of penance is called into question. If God is punishing everyone, what is the point of self-flagellation? If even the holiest priests are dying, where is the divine protection? A profound crisis of faith begins to grip the populace. Doubts, once unthinkable, begin to fester. Is God truly just? Has he abandoned humanity? Or perhaps is the devil more powerful than anyone ever imagined? You've witnessed the terrifying arrival of the plague, the silent ships, and the chilling emptiness that has begun to descend upon your city. The whispers have turned into a roar, and the unseen messenger has delivered its devastating payload. Now, as the initial shock wears off, you confront the horrifying, visceral reality of the disease itself, as it begins its gruesome work on the bodies of your neighbors, your friends, and perhaps even yourself. This is where the true horror of the Black Death becomes manifest, a betrayal of the flesh that leaves no doubt about its deadly intent. A common historical fact is that the Black Death led to a significant decline in the authority and prestige of the church. People saw priests fleeing, sacraments unadministered, and prayers seemingly unanswered. This disillusionment contributed to a questioning of papal authority and ultimately paved the way for future religious reforms, including the Protestant Reformation centuries later. Imagine, if you will, the first time you see it up close. Perhaps it's on a child, a small innocent face now contorted in pain, or on an older man, once robust, now lying helpless. You approach cautiously, your heart pounding, drawn by a morbid curiosity and a desperate need to understand this invisible enemy. And then you see them, the buboes. The sheer number of deaths among the clergy themselves is a devastating blow. Priests, monks, nuns, and friars, who bravely tend to the sick, administer last rites, and bury the dead, are among the first to succumb due to their constant contact with the infected. Their ranks are decimated, leaving countless parishes without spiritual guidance. The comforting presence of the church, once a constant in every community, is now often absent, its voice silenced by death. These are not mere swellings. They are grotesque, angry lumps, often the size of an apple or a goose egg, appearing predominantly in the groin, armpits, or neck. They are black, or a deep, bruised purple, hot to the touch, and exquisitely painful. The skin around them is taut and shiny, stretched to its limit, and sometimes you can even see the dark, engorged veins beneath the surface. They throb with an internal pressure, a visible manifestation of the battle raging within the body. The sight of them sends a cold shiver down your spine, a primal revulsion mixed with profound terror. For you know, instinctively, that this is the mark of death. You witness the profound grief of those who lose their spiritual leaders. The local priest, who baptized your children and comforted you in times of sorrow, is suddenly gone. The familiar rituals that provided structure and meaning to your life are no longer available. You are left to grapple with death and despair largely alone, without the traditional spiritual support system that had always been there. The buboes are accompanied by a sudden, violent onset of symptoms. The victim is seized by a high fever, their skin burning to the touch, their eyes glazed and distant. Chills rack their body, causing them to shiver uncontrollably, even beneath heavy blankets. Excruciating headaches pound behind their eyes, and a profound fatigue washes over them, rendering them utterly helpless. They complain of intense pain in their limbs and joints, as if their very bones are aching. This common historical fact, the rapid onset of fever, chills, and buboes, was the defining clinical picture of the bubonic plague. A less known detail you might observe is the rise of ad hoc religious practices and beliefs. With formal clergy scarce, ordinary people began to take on roles traditionally reserved for priests. Lay people might administer last rites, lead prayers, or even perform makeshift burials. Superstition, already prevalent, intensified, with people turning to charms, amulets, and folk remedies, blurring the lines between traditional faith and ancient magical beliefs. You might see a desperate mother clutching a strange, carved idol while whispering a Hail Mary, a testament to the desperate need for any form of protection. The speed of the disease's progression is terrifying. A person might be walking and talking, seemingly healthy in the morning. By afternoon, they are feverish and weak. By evening, the buboes have appeared, and they are racked with pain and delirium. And by the next morning, or even sooner, they are dead. This brutal swiftness leaves no time for farewells, no time for solace, no time for acceptance. Life is simply snuffed out, abruptly and cruelly, leaving behind a profound sense of shock and helplessness among the living. You might even find yourself thinking, well, that escalated quickly. The concept of purgatory, a place where souls atoned for their sins before entering heaven, becomes a terrifying reality. With so many dying suddenly, without confession or last rites, the fear of eternal damnation or prolonged suffering in purgatory becomes overwhelming. People desperately try to secure masses for the dead, to ensure their loved ones' souls are not lost. But even this becomes difficult with so few priests remaining. As the disease progresses, other horrifying symptoms manifest. The victim's breath becomes foul, their tongue black and swollen. They might experience vomiting, sometimes of blood, and severe diarrhea, further dehydrating their already weakened bodies. Small black spots, known as God's tokens or rosebuds of death, might appear on the skin, particularly on the chest and neck, indicating internal hemorrhaging. These are the signs of a body utterly overwhelmed by the infection, its systems shutting down one by one. The moral fabric of society also begins to fray under the pressure. If God has abandoned humanity, if death is inevitable and random, then what is the point of living a virtuous life? Some turn to wild abandon, indulging in reckless pleasures, believing that if tomorrow they die, they might as well enjoy today. Others become utterly cynical, their faith shattered, their lives consumed by despair. You might even hear someone quip, well, if God's taking a vacation, so am I. The pain from the buboes is agonizing. Victims writhe in agony, crying out in delirium, begging for relief that never comes. The swelling can become so extreme that the skin breaks open, releasing a foul-smelling pus and blood. This open wound, far from bringing relief, often becomes a secondary site of infection, further hastening the victim's demise. You hear the screams, the moans, the desperate pleas, and the sounds haunt your waking hours and invade your nightmares. Historians still debate whether the Black Death fundamentally altered medieval theology and popular piety, or if it merely amplified existing anxieties and led to a temporary surge in extreme religious practices. It's a complex question, as the long-term effects on religious thought are difficult to disentangle from other social and political changes of the era. But for you, living through it, the crisis of faith is immediate and deeply personal. A less-known detail you might observe is the strange, almost magnetic attraction of flies to the dying. As the body succumbs, a cloud of flies often gathers, drawn by the scent of decay and the warmth of the fevered flesh. They crawl over the victim's face, their buzzing a macabre symphony accompanying the final moments. It's a small, repulsive detail that underscores the utter degradation of the dying process during the plague. You might swat at them instinctively, but they are relentless, a grim herald of what's to come. The church's wealth, which you've seen in earlier chapters, also becomes a point of contention. While many clergy die, the church's vast landholdings and treasures remain. Some people question why the church isn't doing more to alleviate suffering, why its wealth isn't being used to feed the hungry or care for the sick. Resentment against the perceived greed and hypocrisy of the church hierarchy begins to simmer, further eroding its authority. The psychological impact on the victim is immense. They are aware, for a time, of what is happening to them. They see the buboes. They feel the excruciating pain. They understand that death is rapidly approaching. The terror of knowing your body is betraying you, that you are rotting from the inside out, is a torment far beyond the physical pain. They struggle with delirium, with hallucinations, with the overwhelming fear of their impending doom. The psychological toll of this spiritual crisis is immense. You live with a constant sense of existential dread, grappling with questions of divine justice, free will, and the meaning of suffering. The comforting certainties of faith, once a source of strength, have been replaced by agonizing doubts. You feel spiritually adrift, searching for answers in a world where God seems to be silent, or worse, indifferent. For those who try to care for the sick, the experience is equally harrowing. You try to offer comfort, to administer the feudal remedies of the time, to simply be present. But the stench of the sick room, the sight of the buboes, the sounds of suffering, and the constant fear of contagion take a heavy toll. You wear cloth soaked in vinegar over your mouth and nose, hoping it will ward off the bad air. But you know, deep down, that it offers little real protection. You might even find yourself holding your breath for long stretches, a desperate, futile attempt to avoid the invisible killer. The very act of prayer becomes a desperate plea, often unanswered. You pray for your loved ones, for your community, for an end to the plague, but the deaths continue relentlessly. The silence from above is deafening, leaving you with a profound sense of abandonment. You might continue to pray out of habit, or out of a desperate, lingering hope, but the fervor is often replaced by a quiet, aching despair. The sheer number of sick and dying quickly overwhelms any semblance of medical care. Doctors are few, and their methods are useless. Priests are overwhelmed by the demand for last rites, often succumbing themselves. Families are left to care for their own, or to abandon them in terror. The sick lie in their beds, often unattended, their cries unheard in the vast, silent suffering of the city. The concept of a healthcare system as you know it is utterly alien. There is only desperate individual struggle. The Black Death, you realize, is not just a physical plague that kills the body. It is a spiritual plague that attacks the soul. It strips away not only lives, but also faith, hope, and the comforting illusion of divine order. It forces humanity to confront its own fragility, its own insignificance in the face of overwhelming natural forces, and the terrifying possibility of a silent, indifferent God. Historians still debate whether the bubonic plague was the only form of the Black Death, or if the more deadly pneumonic and septicemic forms, which spread directly from person to person, also played a significant role in its rapid transmission and high mortality rates. The accounts often blend symptoms, making it difficult to differentiate retrospectively. But for you, living through it, the specific medical distinctions are meaningless. All you know is that people are dying, horribly and quickly, as night falls and the city is plunged into an even deeper silence. You might find yourself staring up at the star-filled sky, searching for a sign, a glimmer of hope, a whisper of divine presence. But there is only the vast, cold emptiness of the cosmos, mirroring the void that has opened in your own heart. You are here, in the midst of the Black Death, and your faith, like so much else, is being tested, leaving you to grapple with God's silence in a world consumed by suffering. The fear of contagion leads to desperate measures. Some people try to lance the buboes, believing that draining the pus will cure the disease. This often leads to further infection and a quicker death. Others try to burn the buboes with hot irons, a barbaric and excruciating practice that offers no relief. These desperate, futile attempts at self-treatment highlight the utter lack of effective medical knowledge and the sheer terror that gripped the population. You might see someone trying to pop a bubo and think, oh, that's just a bad idea. You have grappled with the profound crisis of faith, the agonizing silence of God, and the overwhelming spiritual despair that gripped your world. You have witnessed the physical horrors of the buboes, the collapse of society, the mass graves, and the brutal search for scapegoats. Now, as the Black Death continues its relentless, indiscriminate slaughter, you begin to see another equally devastating transformation, the complete and utter economic ruin. A force that reshapes the very foundations of your society and leaves behind a world irrevocably altered by death. The presence of death becomes normalized. You see bodies in the streets, in doorways, in abandoned homes. The sheer volume of the dead means that traditional burial rituals are often abandoned. Bodies are stripped of their clothing, which might be looted by desperate survivors, piled onto carts, and unceremoniously dumped into mass graves. The dignity of death, a small comfort in normal times, is utterly lost in the face of such widespread calamity. Imagine yourself in a city that was once a bustling hub of commerce. The markets, once overflowing with goods and alive with the shouts of vendors, are now eerily silent, their stalls empty. The workshops, where artisans once toiled, stand dark and abandoned, their tools gathering dust. The roads leading into the city, once crowded with merchants and their wares, are now deserted, overgrown with weeds. The vibrant pulse of economic life has flatlined, replaced by a chilling stillness. The psychological toll on the survivors is immense. They witness horrors that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The images of the buboes, the screams of the dying, the stench of decay, these are etched into their memories. They live with a profound sense of survivor's guilt, wondering why they were spared when so many others perished. The world they knew has been shattered, and their understanding of life, death, and divine justice has been irrevocably altered. The most immediate and devastating impact is the catastrophic loss of labor. Farmers die in their fields, leaving crops to rot. Artisans die at their benches, their skills lost forever. Merchants die in their homes, their businesses collapsing. The sheer number of deaths means that there are simply not enough hands left to work the land, to produce goods, or to transport them. The entire system of production and distribution, built over centuries, crumbles in a matter of weeks and months. The very air seems to vibrate with the presence of death. The pervasive odor of decay, of unwashed bodies, of burning incense trying to mask the stench, becomes a constant assault on your senses. You try to breathe shallowly to cover your nose with a cloth, but it's an inescapable reality. The city, once a vibrant hub of life, has become a vast, open graveyard. Its every corner a testament to the horrifying reality of the buboes and the swift, agonizing death they herald. You see the fields, once meticulously cultivated, now lying fallow, choked with weeds. The few surviving farmers, overwhelmed and exhausted, cannot possibly tend to all the land. Livestock, left untended, roam freely or starve. The harvest, if it happens at all, is meager, leading to widespread famine even in areas not directly hit by the plague, as food supplies dwindle and transportation networks collapse. The gnawing hunger, which you've known before, returns with a vengeance, but this time, it's not just about scarcity, it's about a complete breakdown of the food supply chain, as the days turn into weeks and the buboes continue to appear on new victims. You realize that this is not just a passing illness. This is a cataclysm, a force of nature that is reshaping your world, one agonizing death at a time. The horrifying reality of the Black Death is no longer a distant rumor. It is a visceral, agonizing truth, etched onto the bodies of the dying, and into the very fabric of your existence. You are here in the midst of the plague, and the buboes are everywhere. The urban economy fares no better. Guilds, once powerful organizations of skilled craftsmen, are decimated. Apprentices die, masters die, leaving no one to pass on centuries of accumulated knowledge and skill. Workshops that once produced fine textiles, metalwork, or leather goods are now silent. The quality of goods, if any are produced, declines drastically, as inexperienced hands try to fill the void left by the dead. You might even find yourself trying to fix a broken tool and thinking, well, I guess I'm a blacksmith now. Sort of. You have witnessed the horrifying physical manifestation of the Black Death, the gruesome buboes, and the terrifying speed with which it claims its victims. The city, once bustling, is now a landscape of suffering and death. But as the death toll continues its relentless ascent, you begin to see another equally terrifying transformation. The very fabric of society, the order, the laws, the customs that once governed your world, begin to unravel, dissolving into chaos and despair. Trade, the lifeblood of medieval Europe, grinds to a halt. Merchants die, their ships lie idle in harbors, or return with dead crews. The fear of contagion means that many cities refuse to accept goods from plague-stricken areas, further isolating communities and severing vital economic ties. The flow of goods and money, once a steady stream, becomes a trickle, then stops entirely. The vibrant international trade networks that had connected Europe to Asia and Africa are shattered, leaving behind a fragmented and impoverished continent. Imagine, if you will, the city a few weeks into the plague's full fury. The constant tolling of church bells has become a maddening drone, a relentless symphony of death. The streets, once crowded, are now eerily empty, save for the occasional cart piled high with bodies, or a solitary figure hurrying, head bowed, trying to avoid contact. The vibrant life of the city has been replaced by a chilling silence, broken only by the sounds of suffering and the cries of the bereaved. A common historical fact is that the Black Death created a massive labor shortage across Europe. With so many people dead, the surviving peasants and laborers suddenly found themselves in a position of unprecedented bargaining power. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and even greater freedoms from their lords, leading to a profound shift in the feudal system. This was a radical change, as the traditional power dynamic between lord and serf was suddenly inverted. The first institution to buckle under the pressure is the church. Priests, monks, and nuns, who bravely tend to the sick and administer last rites, are among the first to succumb. Their close contact with the dying makes them highly vulnerable, and their ranks are decimated. Churches stand empty, their altars unlit, their bells silent save for the death knell. The comforting rituals of faith, confession, communion, burial become impossible to maintain. This common historical fact, the high mortality rate among the clergy, severely impacted the spiritual life of communities. You witnessed this shift firsthand? Lords, desperate for labor to work their lands, are forced to offer concessions they would never have considered before. Peasants, who once toiled in virtual servitude, now have options. They can leave their manors, seeking better opportunities elsewhere, or demand significantly higher pay for their work. This leads to widespread social unrest, as lords try to resist these changes, sometimes violently. But ultimately, they are fighting against an unstoppable tide. With the church weakened and its leaders dying, people's faith is profoundly tested. For some, the plague is seen as God's divine punishment for the sins of humanity, leading to desperate acts of repentance, like the flagellant movement, where groups of people publicly whip themselves as a form of atonement. You might see them in the streets, their backs raw and bleeding, their chants echoing eerily through the deserted city. For others, however, the plague leads to a profound crisis of faith. How could a loving God allow such suffering? Why are the righteous dying alongside the wicked? The very foundation of their worldview begins to crack. A less-known detail you might observe is the sudden abundance of abandoned property. Houses, shops, and even entire farms are left empty, their owners having died without heirs. This creates a strange paradox: immense wealth in terms of land and property, but no one to work it, no one to occupy it, and no one to buy it. The concept of value itself becomes distorted in a world where human life is the most precious and scarcest commodity. You might walk past a grand, empty house and wonder who will ever live there again, or if it will simply rot into ruin. The legal system, already fragile in medieval times, quickly disintegrates. Judges and magistrates fall ill or flee. Prisons, already overcrowded and unsanitary, become death traps, their inmates succumbing to the plague. The few remaining officials are overwhelmed by the sheer scale of death and the breakdown of order. Laws become meaningless in a world where survival is the only imperative. You might see a thief openly looting a deserted shop, knowing there's no one left to stop them. You might even find yourself thinking, well, that's certainly a free-for-all market. The financial system also collapses. Banks fail as loans go unpaid and debtors die. Coinage becomes scarce, and the traditional mechanisms of credit and exchange break down. Bartering returns as a common form of transaction, a throwback to simpler, less developed economies. The intricate web of financial relationships that underpinned medieval society unravels, leaving behind a chaotic and unpredictable economic landscape. The bonds of family, once sacred and unbreakable, are severely tested. Fear of contagion drives people to desperate acts. Parents abandon sick children. Children abandon sick parents. Spouses flee from their dying partners. The instinct for self-preservation, primal and overwhelming, often overrides the deepest human connections. You witness these heartbreaking betrayals, the profound loneliness of the dying, left to suffer and die alone. The very idea of familial love, a cornerstone of society, seems to crumble under the weight of terror. The psychological impact of this economic ruin is profound. People who once had stable livelihoods find themselves destitute, their skills suddenly worthless in a world without demand. The future, once predictable, becomes utterly uncertain. Despair and hopelessness become widespread as people struggle to comprehend a world where their efforts yield no reward, and their very survival is a daily gamble. You might even hear someone sigh. Well, at least I don't have to worry about my retirement plan anymore. A less-known detail you might observe is the breakdown of traditional mourning rituals. With so many dying so quickly, and so few left to bury them, the elaborate funeral processions, wakes, and periods of mourning become impossible. Bodies are often stripped of their clothing, which might be looted by desperate survivors, piled onto carts, and unceremoniously dumped into mass graves. The dignity of death, a small comfort in normal times, is utterly lost. replaced by a grim assembly line disposal of the dead. You might see a cart piled high with bodies, and the only sound is the creak of the wheels, a chilling silence. Historians still debate whether the economic changes brought about by the Black Death were ultimately beneficial in the long run, by leading to the decline of feudalism and the rise of a more modern, labor-centric economy, or if the initial devastation and suffering outweighed any long-term gains. It's a complex question, as the plague certainly accelerated many pre-existing trends, but its immediate impact was undeniably catastrophic. But for you, living through it, the suffering is immediate and overwhelming. The economy grinds to a halt. Merchants die, trade routes are abandoned, and workshops close. The supply chains that brought food and goods into the city are severed. Prices for basic necessities skyrocket, if they can be found at all. The few remaining laborers, suddenly in high demand, can command exorbitant wages, but there are few goods to buy. The entire system of commerce, built over centuries, collapses in a matter of weeks, leaving widespread destitution and hunger. The price of labor skyrockets, but the price of land plummets. This creates new opportunities for the few survivors who are able to capitalize on the chaos. Some peasants are able to buy land for the first time, becoming independent farmers. New social classes begin to emerge, as the old feudal order slowly gives way to a more fluid, albeit still brutal system. The plague, in a strange and terrible way, acts as a great equalizer, albeit one that uses death as its primary tool. The social hierarchy, once rigid and seemingly immutable, also begins to fray. Lords and ladies, as susceptible to the plague as their serfs, die in their opulent palaces. The traditional deference to authority weakens as people realize that wealth and status offer no protection from the unseen killer. The lines between rich and poor, noble and commoner, blur in the face of universal suffering. While some still cling to their privileges, the power dynamic is irrevocably altered by the sheer randomness of death. The disruption to trade also leads to a decline in the availability of luxury goods, imported silks, spices, and fine wines. Once symbols of wealth and status become incredibly rare, the focus shifts to basic necessities, to survival. The vibrant cultural exchange that characterized the early medieval period is curtailed, as communities turn inward, struggling to simply sustain themselves. The psychological impact of this societal collapse is profound. People lose their sense of purpose, their hope for the future. The world they knew, with its rules, its comforts, its certainties, has vanished. Despair becomes a pervasive emotion, leading to widespread apathy, or, conversely, to wild, reckless behavior. Some turn to excessive drinking, gambling, and debauchery, believing that if death is inevitable, they might as well enjoy their last moments. You might even hear someone declare YOLO medieval style with a grim, desperate laugh. The very concept of work changes. With labor so scarce and death so common, the value of human life, at least in economic terms, increases dramatically. This leads to innovations in agriculture and manufacturing, as people seek ways to produce more with fewer hands. New technologies and methods, once resisted, are now embraced out of necessity. The plague, in its own grim way, forces a period of reluctant innovation. Historians still debate whether the Black Death was the primary catalyst for the eventual decline of feudalism and the rise of a more labor-centric economy, or if these changes were already underway and merely accelerated by the plague. It's a complex question, as the plague certainly created immense labor shortages, giving peasants more bargaining power. But for you, living through it, the changes are immediate and terrifying. The psychological toll on those who survive the economic ruin is immense. They are forced to adapt to a world utterly unlike the one they knew. Their skills may be obsolete, their social status inverted, their future uncertain. They carry the trauma of loss, not just of loved ones, but of their entire way of life. The world has been turned upside down, and they are left to navigate its chaotic, unpredictable new reality. The fear of contagion leads to extreme social isolation. People barricade themselves in their homes, refusing to open their doors to anyone, even family members. Neighbors avoid each other. Communication breaks down, and the sense of community, once vital for survival, evaporates. The city becomes a collection of isolated, terrified individuals, each waiting for their inevitable fate. The Black Death, you realize, is not just a biological plague, It is an economic plague, a force that systematically dismantles every aspect of your society's financial and labor systems. It strips away not only lives, but also livelihoods, wealth, and the very structure of commerce. It forces humanity to confront the fragility of its economic systems and the profound impact that a demographic catastrophe can have on every aspect of human existence. The dead are everywhere, not just in the streets, but in houses, in shops, in churches. The stench of decay becomes overwhelming, a constant reminder of the plague's relentless work. The air itself seems heavy with death, a miasma of fear and decomposition. You learn to walk with a cloth over your nose and mouth, not just for protection, but to block out the unbearable odor. As night falls and the silence of the empty markets presses in, you hear only the distant howl of a hungry dog, a mournful lament that seems to echo the economic despair of the entire world. You close your eyes, but the images of fallow fields, abandoned workshops, and the desperate faces of the unemployed linger in your mind. You are here, in the midst of the Black Death, and the economic ruin is a chilling testament to its horrifying reality, transforming your world in ways you never imagined. The chaos also breeds violence. With law enforcement gone and social norms abandoned, desperate individuals resort to looting, murder, and other crimes. The weak are preyed upon, the vulnerable exploited. The city, once a place of order, becomes a dangerous, lawless wilderness, where survival often depends on your own strength and cunning. You might even find yourself carrying a weapon, a stark necessity in this new, brutal reality. You have endured the horrifying physical manifestations of the Black Death, witnessed the collapse of society, grappled with the profound crisis of faith, and survived the utter economic ruin that swept across your world. You have seen the mass graves, the unburied dead, and the brutal search for scapegoats. Now, as the plague finally begins to recede, leaving behind a decimated population and a landscape of ghosts, you are left to confront its ultimate, most enduring reality, a scarred legacy, a world forever altered by death, and the profound, lasting trauma that will shape generations to come. The very concept of time seems to lose its meaning. Days bleed into weeks, marked only by the rising death toll and the deepening despair. The future is an unimaginable void, and the past a fading memory of a world that no longer exists. You live in a perpetual present, focused solely on the immediate moment, on the next breath, on the next meal, on the next day of survival. Imagine yourself in the aftermath. The constant tolling of the death bells has finally ceased. The overwhelming stench of decay has begun to dissipate, replaced by the faint, earthy smell of damp soil and new growth. The streets, though still eerily quiet, are no longer littered with corpses. A fragile, tentative sense of relief begins to spread, like a hesitant sunrise after an endless night. The plague has passed, for now, but its shadow lingers, a pervasive presence in every aspect of your life. The Black Death, you realize, is not just a biological plague. It is a social plague, a force that systematically dismantles every pillar of your society. It exposes the fragility of human institutions, the limitations of human knowledge, and the depths of both human cruelty and resilience. The world you knew, with its intricate web of relationships, its established order, and its comforting certainties, has been utterly shattered. The world you inhabit is fundamentally different. The population has been drastically reduced, perhaps by a third or even half in your region. The faces you see are fewer, and those who remain bear the marks of survival, gaunt features, haunted eyes, and a quiet weariness that speaks of unimaginable loss. Every family has been touched. Every household has stories of those who are gone. The silence of the missing is deafening, a constant reminder of the vast emptiness left behind. As night falls, and the silence of the city presses in, you hear only the distant, mournful tolling of a lone church bell, a final, desperate cry in the overwhelming darkness. You are here, in the midst of the Black Death, and society, as you knew it, has dissolved into chaos, leaving you to navigate a world transformed by death. The loss of life is not just a statistic. It's a profound cultural and social wound. Entire lineages have been extinguished, ancient families wiped out. The collective memory of skills, knowledge, and traditions has been severely disrupted. The vibrant tapestry of medieval life, with its intricate social structures and communal bonds, has been torn apart, leaving gaping holes that may never be fully mended. You have witnessed the terrible collapse of society, as order disintegrated into chaos under the relentless onslaught of the Black Death. The deserted streets, the silent churches, and the disintegration of family ties have left a deep scar. Now, as death continues to sweep through, you see a different human response to this incomprehensible horror, a desperate, sometimes bizarre, search for means of survival, futile attempts to fight an invisible enemy. The psychological trauma is immense and enduring. You, and everyone around you, have witnessed horrors that defy comprehension. The agonizing deaths, the abandonment of loved ones, the breakdown of law and order, the mass burials. These images are seared into your memory, haunting your dreams and coloring your waking hours. A pervasive sense of melancholy, a quiet despair, settles over the survivors. The world is no longer a safe or predictable place. It is a realm where death can strike without warning, leaving behind only silence and sorrow. Imagine yourself in the middle of a plague-stricken city. The church bells ring incessantly, and the stench of death hangs in the air. Fear is a tangible thing, clinging to you like a cold veil. In this desperation, people cling to any hope, no matter how small, any remedy, no matter how bizarre, against this invisible killer. A common historical fact is that the Black Death significantly altered the relationship between peasants and lords, leading to the decline of feudalism. With such a drastic reduction in the labor force, surviving peasants gained unprecedented bargaining power. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and greater freedoms, often leading to increased social mobility and a weakening of the traditional manorial system. This shift was revolutionary, fundamentally reshaping the economic and social landscape of Europe. The doctors, whom you once trusted, are now panicked and helpless. They do not understand the cause of the disease, and their medical theories, based on the ancient theory of the four humors, are completely inadequate. You see them trying to bleed patients, believing that removing the bad blood will eliminate the disease. They slash the veins with knives or place leeches on the skin, hoping to draw out the toxic blood. You watch these scenes, knowing that they only weaken already weakened bodies and often hasten death. You may say to yourself, well, at least they're trying in their own way. You witness this power shift firsthand. The lords, desperate for labor to work their vast, now empty lands, are forced to make concessions they would have scoffed at before. Peasants, who once toiled in virtual servitude, now have options. They can leave their manors, seeking better opportunities in towns or on other estates. This leads to widespread social unrest, as the old order tries to cling to its power, sometimes violently, but ultimately, the tide of change is too strong. You might even hear a peasant joke. Guess the Lord's going to have to learn to plow his own fields now. What a plague! It is a common historical fact that plague doctors often wore special garb, including a long gown made of thick cloth, gloves, and a beak-shaped mask filled with aromatic herbs. They believed that this mask would filter out the poisonous miasma air and protect them from the disease. While this suit may seem strange, it was an attempt to protect oneself in an era without knowledge of bacteria. The economic landscape is irrevocably transformed. The value of labor skyrockets, while the value of land, with fewer people to work it, plummets. This creates new opportunities for the enterprising few. Some peasants are able to buy land for the first time, becoming independent farmers. New trades emerge, new markets develop, as society adapts to the new realities of a drastically reduced population. The plague, in its own grim way, acts as a catalyst for economic innovation and social change, albeit one born of unimaginable suffering. Other treatments were equally bizarre. You would see people applying patches made from tree resins, herbs, or even feces to the buboes, hoping that they would rupture or draw out the poison. Some would try to burn the buboes with hot irons, a brutal and horribly painful method that often led to infection and a quicker death. The screams of those tortured by these remedies echoed through the deserted streets. Superstition and belief in folk remedies also flourished. People clung to charms, to the power of gemstones, to wearing herbs or garlic around their necks to ward off illness. You saw people carrying small bags of strong-smelling herbs, or burning bundles of incense in their homes, believing that the scent would purify the air and protect them from poisonous air. While these had no medical effect, They provided a false sense of control in a situation of utter helplessness. A less known detail you might observe is the sudden focus on practical skills and trades. With so many skilled artisans gone, there's a desperate need for those who can build, repair, and create. Apprenticeships become highly sought after, and individuals with practical knowledge find themselves in a position of newfound importance and wealth. The emphasis shifts from inherited status to acquired skill, a subtle but significant change in social values. You might see a young carpenter, barely out of his teens, suddenly commanding respect that would have been unthinkable before the plague. A little-known detail was the use of live pigeons to suck disease out of the body. People would cut a live pigeon in half and place it on the bubo, believing that the heat from the bird's body would draw out the poison. When the bird died, they would replace it with another. This was a brutal and futile method, but it showed the level of desperation to which humans had reached. You might think, surely doves don't sign up for this. The church, as you recall, suffered immense losses and a profound crisis of authority. While it slowly begins to rebuild its ranks, the trust and unquestioning faith it once commanded are irrevocably damaged. People question its power, its interpretations, and its ability to provide solace in the face of such overwhelming suffering. This disillusionment contributes to a growing spirit of inquiry and dissent. Laying groundwork for future religious reforms and the eventual fracturing of Christian unity, prayer and penance became another popular remedy. Believing that the plague was a punishment from God, many people turned to religion in a fanatical way. You saw people kneeling in the streets, praying unceasingly, asking God for forgiveness. Pilgrims made arduous journeys to shrines, hoping their piety would be rewarded with salvation. Flagellant movements became popular, where groups of people publicly flogged themselves with whips, believing that the physical suffering would atone for their sins and appease God's wrath. The artistic and cultural landscape also reflects the trauma. While the Renaissance, with its humanistic ideals, would eventually emerge, the immediate aftermath of the Black Death sees a shift towards darker, more morbid themes in art and literature. The Dance of Death. Dance macabre becomes a popular motif, depicting skeletons leading people of all social classes in a macabre procession, a stark reminder of death's universality and the fragility of life. The vibrant colors of later Renaissance art are still a distant dream. For now, the palette is muted, reflecting the somber mood of the times. However, these acts often only spread the plague faster as the flagellants moved from town to town, carrying germs and fleas with them. You see them, their weary faces, their bleeding wounds, marching through your city. And you wonder if they bring salvation or just death. The concept of time itself is altered. The future, once a predictable progression, is now an uncertain void. People live more in the present, cherishing each day, each moment of health, for they know how quickly it can be snatched away. This leads to a mix of fatalism and a renewed appreciation for life's simple pleasures, a strange duality born from profound loss. You might find yourself savoring a piece of bread more than you ever did before, or simply enjoying the warmth of the sun on your face. Small miracles in a scarred world. Isolation and quarantine were also used, though often ineffective. Families locked themselves in their homes, trying to avoid any contact with the outside world. Ports and cities tried to quarantine those who were sick, or those coming from affected areas. But the disease spread too quickly and too widely for these efforts to be effective. You see houses sealed, doors barred, and you know that inside, people were probably dying. Historians still debate whether the Black Death was the ultimate cause of the decline of the feudal system and the rise of the Renaissance, or if it merely accelerated changes that were already underway due to other factors like climate change, existing economic pressures, and social unrest. It's a complex question, as history is rarely driven by a single cause, but the plague's profound impact on demography and labor markets is undeniable. But for you, having lived through it, the changes feel utterly revolutionary. Historians still debate whether the early measures of quarantine and public hygiene, however crude, played a role in limiting the spread of the disease, or whether they were simply desperate responses that had no significant effect. This is a complicated question because it is difficult to assess the effectiveness of these measures in the absence of scientific knowledge. But for you, the person living it, every effort is worth it, whatever the outcome. The very landscape of Europe is transformed. Villages lie abandoned, their fields overgrown. Towns that once thrived are now mere shadows of their former selves. Forests, once cleared for agriculture, begin to reclaim the land as human populations dwindle. The physical scars of the plague are visible everywhere, a testament to the scale of the devastation. You might walk through a once familiar path and realize that half the houses are gone. Their inhabitants vanished. You might even joke, well, at least there's plenty of room to stretch out now. Fear and despair also lead to reckless behavior. Some people, believing that death is inevitable, turn to debauchery, binge eating, gambling, and promiscuous sex. They live every moment, believing that tomorrow they may be dead. You see crazy parties while others are dying? A terrifying contrast between life and death. Doctors and authorities also tried to find other explanations. Some believed that the plague was caused by a misalignment of the planets, or by poisonous gases rising from the earth. They advised avoiding places with bad smells, burning aromatic herbs, or even carrying flowers to smell. These suggestions, though harmless, were also useless. The psychological toll on children who grew up during the plague years is immense. They are a generation shaped by law, by fear, and by the constant presence of death. They learn resilience, but also carry a deep-seated melancholy. Their understanding of the world is fundamentally different from those who came before them, marked by the trauma of a world turned upside down. Ignorance of the true cause of the plague led to a profound sense of helplessness. People could not fight an enemy they could not see, could not understand. Every effort, whether medical, religious, or superstitious, failed. Death continued to sweep in, regardless of wealth, status, or piety. The Black Death, you realize, was not just a biological plague. It was a societal earthquake, a cataclysm that fundamentally reshaped every aspect of European life. It stripped away not only lives but also certainty, tradition, and innocence. It forced humanity to confront its own fragility, its limitations, and its capacity for both immense suffering and remarkable resilience. The psychological impact of these futile efforts was enormous. Each time a remedy failed, each time a loved one died despite all efforts, the despair deepened. People lost faith in institutions, in medicine, and sometimes in God himself. A sense of helplessness gripped everyone, leaving an indelible mental scar. As you look out at the world, you see the slow, painful process of rebuilding. New generations are born, new communities begin to form, and life, in its relentless way, finds a path forward. But the memory of the plague, the knowledge of what happened, will never truly fade. It is a permanent scar on the collective consciousness, a shadowed legacy that will continue to influence thought, culture, and society for centuries to come. When night fell, and you heard the coughs of the sick, the groans of the dying, and the incessant ringing of church bells, you knew that these desperate remedies were but faint cries in a terrible storm. The Black Death could not be stopped by human means. It was a destructive force of nature, and you, along with everyone else, could only wait, hope, and witness its devastation. You are a survivor, a witness to the greatest catastrophe your world has ever known. You carry the weight of that experience, the memories of loss, the lingering fear, and the profound understanding of life's precious fragility. And as you finally close your eyes, the whispers of history remind you that even in the quiet aftermath, the horrifying reality of the Black Death continues to echo, a chilling testament to the enduring power of trauma and change. You have witnessed the terrifying physical symptoms of the Black Death, the gruesome buboes, and the horrifying speed with which it claims its victims. You've seen society crumble, its order dissolving into chaos, leaving behind a landscape of suffering and death. You've even observed the desperate, often bizarre, attempts to find a cure, all of which have proven utterly futile. Now, as the plague continues its relentless march, consuming lives and hope, you confront another horrifying aspect of human nature in crisis: the desperate, often brutal, search for someone to blame, a scapegoat for the incomprehensible catastrophe that has engulfed your world. As time passed, the scars of the Black Death faded from the surface of the world, but they remained, hidden deep in the collective memory. Fallen fields were plowed again, new villages rose from the ruins, and the laughter of children echoed through the once silent streets. Life had somehow found a way to go on. Imagine yourself in a city gripped by the plague, where the stench of death is a constant companion and the mournful tolling of church bells is the only soundtrack. The initial shock and grief have given way to a pervasive, gnawing fear, which in turn curdles into a desperate need for answers. Why is this happening? Who is responsible for this divine wrath? This unseen killer in a world without scientific understanding of epidemiology, where every misfortune is often attributed to divine will or malicious intent. The search for a culprit becomes an urgent, terrifying imperative. You sensed a change in the air, a fragile relief, but also a deep sadness. The survivors carried with them stories, pain, and a new understanding of the fragility of life. They treasured every moment, every breath, every meal, because they knew the price of loss. The Black Death took so much, but it also left an undeniable legacy, a reshaped world, where people learned to adapt, innovate, and find strength in their own weakness. At first, the blame falls squarely on God. The plague is seen as divine punishment for the sins of humanity. You hear sermons from the few surviving priests, their voices hoarse with despair, preaching fire and brimstone, urging repentance. People confess their sins, perform acts of public penance, and join flagellant processions, whipping themselves bloody in the streets, believing that their suffering will atone for the collective wickedness of mankind and appease an angry God. You might even hear someone lament, "Well, I knew I shouldn't have stolen that extra piece of bread last Tuesday." Now, as you drift off to sleep, let the images of a dark time fade away. Let the mournful bells fade into the distance, and the fears of sickness and death give way to peace. You have been through a terrifying journey, but you have survived. And in the silence of the night, you may hear the whispers of history, reminding you of the power of human resilience, even in the face of the most terrible things. However, as the plague continues its indiscriminate slaughter, claiming the pious as readily as the wicked, the explanation of divine punishment begins to feel insufficient, even cruel. If God is punishing everyone, what is the point of repentance? A new, more tangible target for blame begins to emerge, fueled by fear, prejudice, and the desperate need to find a human face for this inhuman horror. The most common historical fact is that Jewish communities across Europe became primary targets for persecution during the Black Death. They were often accused of poisoning wells, spreading the disease intentionally, or being agents of the devil. These accusations, fueled by centuries of anti-Semitism and economic resentment, led to horrific pogroms and massacres, particularly in Germany and Switzerland. You witness the terrifying spread of these rumors. Whispers turn into shouts, accusations into violent mobs. You hear stories of Jewish people being seen near wells at night, or of them possessing strange, potent powders. These baseless claims, amplified by fear and desperation, quickly ignite a terrifying wave of violence. You see the fear in the eyes of your Jewish neighbors, their faces etched with a familiar dread that has nothing to do with the plague itself, but with the rising tide of hatred. The attacks begin. Mobs, often led by desperate or opportunistic individuals, descend upon Jewish quarters, homes are looted, synagogues burned, and entire communities are massacred. Men, women, and children are dragged from their homes, tortured to extract false confessions, and then brutally murdered, often burned alive in public squares. The screams of the victims mingle with the triumphant shouts of the mob, a horrifying symphony of hatred and terror. The very people who are suffering from the plague are now inflicting unimaginable suffering on others. Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, take our seats, and drift back to a time that history often speaks of with a shudder, the Black Death. You may have heard the stories about it, the pictures of plague doctors with beaked masks, deserted streets, and piles of corpses. But today, we're not just going to look at those images. We're going to put ourselves in the shoes of you, an ordinary person living in Europe in the mid-14th century, when the first whispers of a distant, deadly threat began to creep into your daily life.